Kant's approach to philosophy is a genuinely new approach. The rationalists of the continent are disputing with the empiricists in England how it is that we have knowledge. And so Kant weaves a middle ground for his claims of how we know the world. And this becomes the basis of a very important moral philosophy, the ethics of respect for persons. This principle states that persons are of intrinsic value and should never be used as a means to an end. The metaphysics and the epistemology behind this ethical position is the claim that the mind is structured in a way that it imposes its knowing upon its objects. At the time that Kant lived, there was a scientific culture that attempted to include all of reality, including human nature, in the mechanical model, that is to say that people were determined. There was also the problem that if one relied on observation and took this to its most extreme measure, we throw out causality, which in effect is throwing out the very reason for scientific endeavor. Therefore, Kant's goal is to rescue the realm of moral values and the notion of freedom and God, all of which were threatened by the determinist view of human nature, and he wants to explain and justify the possibility of scientific knowledge without assuming the existence of objects and without throwing out the notion of causality. Kant accepted that knowledge was possible, and so he set out to outline the boundaries of that knowledge. He is a critical mediator between the dogmatism of Locke, the assumption that objects exist, and the skepticism of Hume, the disregard for causality. His critical philosophy rejected what could not be defended in rationalism and empiricism, and it is genuinely a new approach. How does he proceed? Like his predecessor, Leibniz, he looks at the different kinds of truths. Recall that Leibniz claimed there was analytic truth that gave no new information because it was true by definition, that is, it was a priori, without observation. And then there was synthetic knowledge, which added new information to the subject observed after experience. The question for Kant was, is it possible, prior to experience, to be gaining new information? Now, Descartes had always thought that there were innate ideas that we were born with. This is a little bit similar to that because new information does not require observation or experience. The analytic judgment, all bachelors are unmarried men, is a statement that is true by definition, and the predicate is contained in the subject. No observation is required to know this. It can never be false as well. Synthetic judgment, on the other hand, involves statements that the predicate is not contained in the subject, and experience is required in order to give new information to that subject. The door is, and you take a good look, and it can say that it is brown. Synthetic judgments, Kant says, are mostly empirical. That is, new information is given to us after we have observations. But this is where Hume would strongly disagree. He says only most, Kant? No, I don't think so. Hume would say all. Kant says, no, there are some synthetic judgments that do give us new information. And he says mathematics and metaphysics are also synthetic. How is this possible? Especially since metaphysics, in Kant's view, and mathematics are a priori. Mathematical judgments proceed from the law of non-contradiction, and that is why he says that it is a priori. Metaphysics, he says, gives us new information that is non-empirical because the mind is structured in a way that imposes its knowing upon the objects, and the mind gains new information because of these structures. What are these structures? According to Kant, we have three faculties: the intuition, the understanding, and the imagination. The intuition, Kant says, is something that organizes raw data into spatial temporal perception. That is, Kant is not willing to accept the dogmatism of Locke that space and time exist outside the mind. Kant wants to say that it is a faculty of the mind that makes the raw data into spatial and temporal perception. Space and time are like irremovable goggles that the intuition processes. When you think about this is not really unusual. Bats have their own way of experience, as do any other insect with perhaps with faceted eyes. They see differently. Some animals can see infrared light. We cannot. We also cannot see microwaves and cosmic waves, and if we could, the shape of objects would be different. So we see space and time because of the way our mind is structured. Kant also claims that there is categories of thinking that understand, for example, quantity. The mind has a structure that innately understands universal as a quantity. To say that all trees are plants is a universal statement, or to say that some plants are plants for food is a particular statement, and to say that this plant is a peppermint plant is a singular statement. We understand that innately, and new information is given to us. Likewise, the other categories are related to the qualities, and this is the relations between things. We understand the affirmative. We understand the negative. And he says we understand the infinite because we understand mind, which has no length, breadth, or height. We understand relations, and these are logical relations. For example, we understand the categorical syllogism. If I said to you, all A are B, all B are C, you know without experience that all A are C. Likewise true for the hypothetical syllogism. If A occurs, then B is the result. If B occurs, then C is the result. And you know without any experience that if A occurs, then C is the result. The disjunctive syllogism is the presentation of two choices, either A or B, and the denial of one of them, and the remaining choice as the conclusion. We understand modality, that is, we understand possibility. This might be a poison. We understand assertions, this is a poison, and we understand the apodictical, which is causality. If one takes poison, then they could get sick. So, Kant addresses the skepticism of Hume, who said causality was nonsense. For Kant, causality is a structure of the mind. It's the way our mind imposes knowing upon the raw data of experience. So here we have it. We have the uninterpreted data, without which we would have a mind empty of content. And we have the ordering principles of the mind and the categories of thinking, without which that uninterpreted data would be simply gobbledygook and we would have no meaningful experience. So, we need both perception and thinking in order to have meaningful experience. Kant says we can know the phenomenal, that is, the world of perception, of space-time perception, but we cannot know what those things are apart from our perceptions of them. He calls this the noumenal realm. But what about the things that we don't have physical raw data perceptions about, such as God, immortality, and freedom? Kant thinks it's reasonable to postulate that freedom is something in itself, even though we have no phenomenal perception of it. In fact, this is where he begins his theory for ethics. There is no logical necessity for the notions of freedom, for example, but without this, he says, we would lose our enthusiasm for life. The only good will is a free will. This is how Kant begins his claim for ethics. Without ethics, life would be meaningless. Kant assumes that the categorical imperative in his work is something that all rational individuals can discover and agree upon because they have the same structures of mind. This categorical imperative is formulated in one of three ways. The first one is this: one ought to act such that the principle of one's actions could become a universal law of human action in a world in which one would hope to live. What does this mean? Well, if you did an action and then elevated it to the level of universal law, let's take a promise, for example. Let's say I promise that if you come to class, every class, then you will get an A. And let's say you did come to class and I did not give you an A. Well, I gave a promise, did I not? If you come to class, then you will get an A. Let me elevate that broken promise to the level of principle. Let me universalize it. What that implies is that it is all right to give a broken promise. Now, if it's okay to give a broken promise as a universal law, you also could give me a broken promise. You could say, oh, I'm going to get all of my work done, and you never get your work done. What then happens to the institution of promise making? Well, clearly, it falls apart, and you cannot act in accord with promise making anymore. This is the self-defeating test. Can I consent to others acting simultaneously according to the same rule I use without undermining my own ability to act in accordance with that rule? Can I universalize my action to a principle and continue to act in accordance with that rule? The second formulation of the categorical imperative is one ought to treat others as having intrinsic value in themselves, not merely as an ends to achieve one's end, not merely as a means to achieve one's end. You should not use persons as a means to an end. The third formulation is act as if you were, through your maxims, a law-making member of a kingdom of ends. And here Kant says that we freely, through reason, give to ourselves those kinds of maxims that we wish to obey, because they are not self-contradictory, and it continues to allow us to act in accord with them. We freely legislate these maxims to ourselves as the king gives laws to the land, and we as the subjects of those laws act in accordance with them. To be a moral agent, according to Kant, you must have freedom, or you must enter some choice voluntarily. You also must be purposive, that is, be a person who can set goals for herself and achieve them. There is one exception. It's called the principle of forfeiture. If I treat you merely as a means, I forfeit my rights to freedom and well-being. That is, my rights are forfeited in proportion to the rights of others that I trespass. So, for example, if we were all sitting in a room and someone suddenly came in with an axe, we would have the right to defend ourselves, and that person forfeits his right to life or her right to life in accordance with the level of threat to our own. Here's something else embedded in this philosophy. When someone's freedom or well-being must be violated, people should be treated equally unless there's reasons that exist for them to be treated otherwise. And let me give you an example. Let's say there's a freeway that is going to be placed through your neighborhood, and let's say your neighborhood is ethnically diverse, very diverse. Well, in the process of eminent domain, when you have to sell your property to the government in order to have some compensation because those freeways going through your neighborhood, all persons, regardless of ethnicity, should have the market value, the fair market value for their property, should not be discriminated unequally on the basis of race or gender. The duties to self in Kant's philosophy are that you should never, ever commit suicide. It is a perfect duty, which means you are obligated under all occasions to obey that duty. Why is that? Because suicide is contrary to life and is self-contradictory to life itself. You have an imperfect duty, which means that on occasions you should do this duty, not always, but on occasions you have the duty to develop your talents. The duties to other are the ordinary moral prohibition against harm. You should not cause harm to others, ever. The imperfect duty is that you should help others, especially when it's relatively little cost to yourself. The social ethics implied in Kant's work are that institutions should respect the freedom and well-being of others by following rules that are universally applied. John Locke has a contractarian alternative to the categorical imperative. His state of nature includes life, liberty, health, and property. And these, he says, are God-given natural rights. One can accumulate as much natural property as one can use, as long as these side constraints are obeyed. We don't want to have the property that we mix our labor with spoil in accumulation. We want to ensure there's enough left for others, and we want to also ensure that the accumulation is not harmful to others. The measure of the state's value is how well does the state protect the natural rights of the individual.